Hello, everyone. In this lesson, let's discuss experiments. Now, experiments are usually used in psychology. However, it would be unfair to say that experiments are not used in sociology. Before we could get started with experiments, this topic experiments, I'd like you all to have a look at the questions that we've had in the last few years on experiments. So, if I talk about these questions over here, in May June 2022, variant 1.1, we had this 26 mark question that says, evaluate the use of experiments in sociological research. I would want to discuss this particular question in detail in another lesson. However, for now, let's continue. Another question that we had in November 2022, variant 1.2, the question is a 6 mark question and it says, explain two limitations of laboratory experiments. Taking this ahead, in November 2023, variant 1.1, we had another question that says, describe two features of laboratory experiments. Another question in November 2023, variant 1.3, it's probably the same question. The question over here again reads, describe two features of a laboratory experiment. I think this is enough for anyone to know that experiments are important when it comes to covering the topic experiment is important when it comes to A-level sociology, A sociology. So to begin with, usually when we talk about an experiment is an experiment is also referred to as a cause and effect relationship. So an experiment is a method that is used to test the cause and effect relationship. Now the cause over here is also referred to as the independent variable and the effect is referred to as the dependent variable, which we would discuss in a bit now. So an experiment is seen as a method used to test cause and effect relationship by controlling different variables. So when you're conducting an experiment, typically what you do is you try to test the cause and effect relationship by controlling different variables. For this, it is pretty important that we understand what the word variable over here means over here. What the word variable means over here. As we use the word variable, a variable is anything that is subject to change or vary. And if we have a look at what our book has to say, according to our book, variables are things that can vary, such as an individual's social class, their gender, their ethnicity, or it could be a temperature, it could be the temperature, the sound, and the light, if given a particular situation. I'd want to give you all a quick little example over here so that you understand experiments in a better manner. So, what I said was experiments have variables. A variable is something that is subject to change or vary. Now, for instance, if I want to conduct an experiment on the relationship between two variables, and these two variables, let's just say, are the amount of light in a classroom, the amount of light in a classroom, and the concentration level of students. If I want to figure out the relationship between the amount of light in a classroom and the concentration level of students, light would be my independent variable. Light would be my independent variable because this is the variable that I would want to keep on changing or manipulating as an experimenter to see what sort of effect it has on my dependent variable. So let's just say I have three categories over here, L1, L2, L3, where L1 is I take a class with one light switched on, L2 is when I take a class with two lights switched on, and L3 is when I take a class with three lights switched on. Now, I could take a class on Monday with one light switched on Tuesday with two lights switched on, and on Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, with three lights switched on. Now, this would be my independent variable. This would be my independent variable, or in other words, this would be the variable that I would want to change, I would want to manipulate as an experimenter. Now, the changes I'm bringing in this variable would be to check for the effect it has on the concentration level of students. So, my light in this case, in this example, would be my independent variable, and the concentration level of students would be my dependent variable. So, getting back to the definition that we were discussing, an experiment is a method used to test the cause and effect relationship by controlling variables. Now, this would be referred to as the cause. This would be the cause, and this would be the effect. Your independent variable is seen as the cause, and the dependent variable is usually seen as the effect here. So, by controlling variables, now, don't you think if I were to figure out what the effect of light is on the concentration level of students, everything besides light that I can possibly, as an experimenter, control in my classroom, I would want to control. That could affect the concentration level of students. So everything that I can control besides light, I would want to control it so that it is only the change in light that helps me figure out how it is affecting the concentration level of students. Now, for instance, I might want to keep the I'd rather use the word noise. So I'd want to ensure that there is no external noise. I'd want to ensure that the temperature of the room stays constant or stays the same. I would want to ensure that the class layout stays the same, and everything, like I said, that I can control, I should control, so that it is only light that I know is the factor that is affecting the concentration level of students. So in all the three cases over here, L1, L2, L3, on the in all the three days that I mentioned over here, I would ensure that the only thing that is different over here is the light, whereas the noise, the temperature, the class layout, and anything and everything else that I possibly can control, I should control. Getting back to where we were talking about an experiment here and the usage of experiments in sociological researches. Now, like I said, experiments have an independent variable, experiments have a dependent variable as well. An independent variable is referred to as your IV, whereas the dependent variable is referred to as the DV. Experiments, now if we move on and we talk about the different types of experiments, experiments could be broadly put into two main categories. To name them, we have laboratory experiments and we have field experiments. Now, by just using the word laboratory experiment, that doesn't at all mean that the experiment would be conducted in a laboratory. We use the word laboratory experiment to refer to the control a sociologist has over the situation. So as a sociologist, as an experimenter, if you're conducting a research in a controlled situation, in a controlled environment, which usually is an artificial environment, our research or our experiment would be referred to as a laboratory experiment. Let me repeat, a research that is conducted in a controlled or artificial environment is usually referred to as a laboratory experiment. However, when we use the word field experiment has to do with the extent to which a research is conducted in its normal, natural, actual, or real world environment or setting. So, if you're conducting a research in an artificial and controlled environment, you'd refer to that as a laboratory experiment. If you're conducting a research in a real world environment, you'd refer to that as a field experiment. Now, what is the aim of using an experiment? Why do we actually use experiments? Sociologists or researchers, they use experiments to test a particular hypothesis. What is a hypothesis here? We use the word hypothesis to refer to any theory that requires testing. If I refer to the example that I used a couple of minutes ago, I was trying to figure out the relationship between the amount of lights in a classroom and the concentration level of students. In this case, if I, as a researcher, feel that more lights would lead to more of concentration coming from students, that is a hypothesis because that is still something that requires testing. So, the why do we conduct experiments? We typically conduct experiments to test a particular hypothesis. If there's one hypothesis, you would spell it like this. And if there are multiple hypotheses, or a plural to that is hypotheses. So experiments are used to test hypotheses and gather reliable data. Reliable, or in other words, constant data. How is it that we say that we'd be able to conduct, that we'd be able to gather constant or reliable or consistent data? We'd be able to do that by ensuring that the procedure that is being followed in our experiment is standardized. Remember, if the procedure of a particular research is standardized, or if the procedure stays the same, the chances of replication of the research increase. Now, what does the word replication over here mean? Replication means conducting the research in exactly the same manner. So, standardized procedure leads to higher replication. Higher replication leads to higher chances of reliability. Now, for the ones who are still confused, what is the difference between replication and reliability? A research is referred to as a research is referred to as replicable when the researcher can exactly conduct the same research in the same manner. However, reliability is seen as a step ahead. A reliable research is a research when the researcher conducts the research in exactly the same manner again, and additionally, the results come up to be the same. So, for replication, it has to do with the procedure being the same. For reliability, it has to do with the procedure as well as the results being the same. Taking this a little further, to reiterate what I just explained a couple of minutes ago, an experiment is usually designed to see how one variable, that is an independent variable, has an effect on another variable that is a dependent variable. So the independent variable in my example was the amount of light. However, the dependent variable over here was the concentration level of students. Taking this ahead, the researcher can either keep the variables constant or the researcher can manipulate them. Now, if you remember, we were manipulating our variable that is IV, and we were manipulating it as one light, two lights, and three lights. And the other variables, we were talking about keeping them constant. I recall, mentioned temperature. I had mentioned external noise. I think I had mentioned the layout of a classroom. Now, taking this a step further, talking about this a little more in detail, like I said, a laboratory experiment is an experiment that is conducted in an artificial setting. An experiment that is conducted in an artificial setting, we refer to that as a laboratory experiment. And of course, if the setting is artificial, if everything is pre-planned, the likelihood of the researcher or the experimenter having more control of the situation, of course, increases. And the more control a researcher or an experimenter has over the situation, the better chances there are for the researcher to be able to figure out the cause and effect relationship of the variables, right? Remember, your cause was the IV, your effect is the DV. You manipulate as an experimenter, you manipulate or you change your IV to look for its effects on the DV. Now, when you talk about a laboratory experiment, a disadvantage of the usage of laboratory experiment seen is its low ecological validity. What does the word ecological validity over here mean? When I use the word ecological validity has to do with the extent to which a research is conducted in its true environment or normal environment, right? So, and a research would be ecologically valid if it's conducted in its real setting. However, when you talk about a laboratory experiment, we're talking about artificial setting over here. So if you're conducting your research in an artificial setting and not in its real setting, you would refer to that research being low in terms of ecological validity. The findings might not be applicable to real life settings. Why is it that we say that the findings might not be applicable to real life settings? We say this because, remember, for you to ensure that the findings of your research, that the results of your research are applicable to real world situations or real life settings, you need to conduct your research in real life settings in the first place. So when you talk about laboratory experiments, they say laboratory experiments are low in terms of ecological validity. They say laboratory experiments usually have findings that might be questionable if you try to apply them in real world settings because of the high amount of control. Yes, having high amount of control has its pros, has its cons both. High control means you would have better you'd feel more confident about figuring out the cause and effect relationships. However, when you talk about higher controls, that reduces the chances of your research findings being applicable to real world situations. Now, I have a couple of examples of a year over here where laboratory experiments were conducted. This infamous research that is a part of AS psychology as well. That was conducted by Bandura et al. In 1963. Now, this research was conducted by Bandura, like I said, and the idea behind this research was to ensure, no, the idea behind this research was to see the effect the violence that is shown on television could affect children, right? Now, of course, we're talking about a study back in the 1960s, and this study was conducted in the United States. If back then television was something that was probably gaining popularity, and the extent to which violence was shown in television was a concern for many people. So, the research conducted by Bandura et al. Was trying to examine the relationship between violence that is shown on media and the effect it has on the behavior of children. Now, the experimenter put up, I mean, there's more detail to this. Of course, I'm just discussing this at a very surface level because yeah, for psychology students, you'd study this in detail. For sociology students, you'd only be using this as a reference. So when you talk about the study that was conducted by Bandura, the researcher put the participants into two different groups. Some of the participants went through violence. I mean, they went through they saw violence in front of them, and the other group, they it did not see violence in front of them. And what researcher figured out towards the end of the research was that the students, or rather say the children, the small children who were shown violence, actually ended up acting in a violent manner when they got a chance to. So this is, I think, the most simplest and the basic way through which I could get you to understand this research. So the the children who were shown violent activities depicted more of, or acted in a more violent manner as compared to the children who were not shown violent behavior. Another study that was conducted by Harvey and Stalin in the year 1975, they were trying to examine the relationship between teachers' expectations of students' performance and teachers' perception of students' social class. Teachers' expectations as to how good or bad a student would do in relation to the student's social class, in other words, the student being rich or poor. Now, this research was conducted on 96 teachers. They were from 4 elementary schools, and these schools were located in lower and middle class neighborhood areas in a city in the United States. These teachers, they had to judge the potential, or the chances of success and failure of these students. How did they make this judgment? They made this judgment through 18 anonymous photographs of children between 8 to 12 years. And these children were either white children or black children. And the researchers found out that the perceived social class status was more strongly associated with success among white children and with failure amongst the black children. So in a nutshell, teachers' perception about white children was that they would succeed, and teachers' perception about black children was that they might not succeed. Now, moving on towards field experiments real quick here. As we speak about field experiments, like I said, they take place in real world settings beyond the closed controlled environment over here. And when we use the word closed and controlled environment over here, we're actually targeting laboratory experiments. So for field experiments, they have the goods and they have the bads too. If we talk about field experiments over here, because it's a naturalistic setting, it is very difficult for the researcher at times to be able to maintain control over the variables. So because of the naturalistic setting, it might not be possible for the researcher, for the experimenter, to maintain control over the variables. At the same time, experiments are seen to be higher in terms of ecological validity. Experiments are seen to be high in terms of ecological validity. When I talk about ecological validity, if you remember, what I said was ecological validity is the extent to which a research is conducted in its normal, natural, day-to-day, real-world setting. Moving on, let's talk about this reference study that was conducted by Rosenthal and Jacobson. Rosenthal and Jacobson conducted a research on the concept, on the idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is self-fulfilling prophecy. A prophecy is a prediction. What is self-fulfilling prophecy? When we talk about self-fulfilling prophecy, the idea is that the idea is, in this context again, the idea is that if a teacher thinks a student is bright, the teacher, while interacting with the students, might convey that message in a direct or indirect manner, which might consequently lead to the student feeling bright, putting in more efforts, and succeeding, and vice versa. That is, if a teacher thinks that a student is less able, the teacher might somehow communicate that to the student, might not have to say it directly, but somehow might be able to convey that to the student, even when it is done intentionally. This might result in the student carrying a low self-esteem, the student feeling less confident, and consequently the student performing less. So this research was conducted in California in the United States. This was conducted in an elementary school. If we talk about the sample over here, so what actually happened in this research was the researchers randomly got hold of around 20% of the student population and conveyed to the teachers that these students were the most able ones and these were the ones who would succeed ahead, which as a consequence might have resulted in the teachers' perception about those students changing, the teachers' interaction with those students changing. And as a result, it was found out that the prophecy turned out to be true. That is, those random students, I repeat, those random students who were very randomly picked and labeled as high achievers, they consequently showed more of improvement and did better in the examinations. Next, we have this study that was conducted by Mary Sissons in the year 1970. This study was trying to examine the relationship between an individual's social class and individual's interaction with strangers. How is it that an individual's social class affects the interaction strangers have towards him or her? So, in this case, this study had a male actor, and the social class was categorized into a business person and a laborer. This study was conducted on a street in London. In this particular study, the actor, the place, the request that the actor had all stayed the same. And if we talk about the findings from this study, it was found out that people were more helpful towards business person as compared to the rest. Now, these are examples that you could possibly use as examples of laboratory experiment if you ever come across a question in your examination. Taking this ahead, if we move on towards the strengths of the usage of experiments. When we talk about strengths of the usage of laboratory experiments, especially, they allow you to control your variables. That's a strength. They provide quantitative data. That's a strength. Laboratory experiments can be replicated. I've explained that. Field experiments are more realistic. That's a strength again. If we move on to the limitations real quick, participants being aware, see, regardless of the experiment, it is be it a laboratory experiment or a field experiment, participants being aware that they're a part of a research may alter their behavior, which is also referred to as the experimental effect. If a participant knows he or she is being studied, if a participant knows he or she is a part of a research, that might consequently lead to the behavior of that particular individual being changed, being altered, which would of course have a negative effect on the findings of the research. Another limitation over here, the unintended effect of the experimenter on those being studied. Experimenter bias, like we use the word, the unintended effect, could be the social class of the experimenter, could be the gender of the experimenter, could be the ethnicity of the experimenter, or any other factor that affects the behavior of the participants might be, again is the disadvantage. The third disadvantage is in terms of informed consent. In many cases, what happens is researchers choose not to take permission from the participants before they're conducting their research. In their defense, what they feel is if they seek permission from the participants might end up changing their behavior, which is to quite an extent correct. But then again, just because you think someone would change their behavior, that doesn't at all allow you to conduct a research on them without their consent, which again is a disadvantage to be noted here. So this is a disadvantage. So is this one. So is this one. Taking this ahead, if I may give you an example of another research example over here, that is the Hawthorne effect. Many students who have business as a student would know what the Hawthorne effect is. When we use the word the Hawthorne effect, this has to do with a study that was conducted at Hawthorne Works at the Western Electric Company in Chicago, United States, in late 1920s. The researchers were trying to figure out the relationship between the workers' productivity, I repeat, the workers' productivity, and different variables such as heating there, lighting there, and the frequency of rest periods. Now, the conclusion, what the researchers found out was the increase in productivity that was found had more to do with the participants or the workers over there knowing that they were being studied. According to, in a crux, if I try concluding this entire thing, in a simpler manner, the participants or the workers in that particular factory, they were more productive just because they were aware there was a research being conducted on them. Now, of course, we could go on and on and on when it comes to this particular topic, like many other topics in our A-level sociology syllabus. However, I think this was the quickest I could do to help you understand what this is. I'd really appreciate if you all uh, uh, take the notes. You might as well want to go back and watch this again to be able to take notes. And in the next few lessons, we would discuss the questions that we've had on this particular topic too. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.